But welcome everyone, and good evening or good afternoon, wherever in the world you may be. And as Lily mentioned, I am Christine Geluk, and I'll be talking about Power BI and its deliverables. Yes, I am a consultant. I founded my own company about 5 years ago, and feel free to follow me on Twitter. There's my handle right there, CM Haluk. Couple of housekeeping items. Just mark your calendars for next year. But late March in Las Vegas, Nevada for the M365 Collaboration Conference. Hopefully all will be meeting in person. And here's the opportunity to give back. There's 2 charities that you are welcome to donate to, either one or the other, or both if you can, United Way and International Medical Corps. Besides the awesome organizers that made the M365 Virtual Marathon possible, it couldn't have been without also the contribution of the generous sponsors that you see on the screen right here. And just a little bit more about myself, being a librarian, why not? The terms that you see here in the word cloud make up or describe me both professionally and personally. Yes, I'm a librarian with a scientific background, specifically mathematician. Hint, hint, it is the pure science, despite what all my chemist friends may say. No, joking, I also love chemistry as well. But feel free to read more about me on my consultant website right there, Librarian at Your Service. That includes also all my social media channels if you'd like to connect. So now let's get into the nitty gritty. Let's talk about Power BI. So for tonight's session, I'm just going to go over a general overview and design, and then getting into the specifics of how to really transform that data into that story, and then going into that live build. I'm a Catholic, so I'm generally Catholic, prayer to the demo gods. And then we'll just recap with a few resources, and as we head into any sort of questions that may have transpired. So when you're working with Power BI, and whether or not you might be completely new or you're already working on it for a little while, there's 2 things that you want to be considered, is that there are complementary tools. There's the desktop app, Power BI Desktop, which in itself is a free tool. It's a free download. And the web service, the Power BI service. They're not really exclusive. You work with both to build that story in order to share it out with the audience for them to consume. Now, how you build it really depends on whether or not you stay as the free user, Power BI, or the add-on feature of Power BI Pro. Now, for those customers that are E5 tenants, the Power BI Pro is included, so it won't be an add-on. The Venn diagram that you see before you differentiates the features that you can do in the desktop app and what you can do in the web service. And the shared attributes are what you can do in both. So as you can see, they're complementary because there's many more features that you only have access to through the desktop app that you won't through the web application. So that's something to keep in mind. So again, it's complementary. They're not exclusive of one another. And when it comes between the free version and the fee version, i.e. Power BI Pro, there are the advantages over the fee version, Power BI Pro. And here is what highlights those key advantages that were discussed in really a blog article that's already a little over 2 years old, but it's still specific today. So that's something that if you are developing those stories, it is to your advantage to be a Power BI Pro user, regardless of tenant. If you're going to consume the data, you might be okay with the Power BI, but that gets into a whole different story of whether or not your organization has Power BI Premium. Not to be confused with Power BI Pro, and it's not a replacement for Power BI Pro. Power BI Premium allows the organization to consume deliverables made by Power BI Pro users to non-pro users without a pro license. So having a premium license does not exclude you from needing a pro. If you're going to be developing reports and dashboards and really developing that story, you do need a pro license. Now, again, if you're E5, it's included, so it's not an additional add-on. So when it comes to Power BI, really the components with transforming that data consists of the data sets that you build the pages, and those pages make up the reports, and then finally the dashboards. Now, here's a key item to remember, is that you don't need to really create a dashboard each and every time. You could if you want, but it all depends on what story you want to tell and who's your audience. So you could still leave it at the report level and share out the report for your audience to consume that data. You don't have to take it to the dashboard level. Now, of course, if you take it to the dashboard level, you need to be a pro user, because the free user, you won't be able to create that dashboard. And again, I've included various information from the Microsoft documentation site regarding the differentiation between the pages, reports, and dashboards. So here's a bit of trivia for those that like trivia and history. So for those that may or may not have known, Microsoft, when it comes to many of its products, they didn't come out under the brand that they may have ended up as. Of course, they started out as a specific research project with a code name. And Power BI was not foreign to that. That the code name for Power BI was Project Crescent. And I won't play the video, but it's included in the presentation. And the presentation will be available both on the conference's YouTube channel now and eventually my website. So you could watch it at your leisure. And the resources on Project Crescent, including a couple of blog articles, are in my resource slide. So you'll have that information. But basically, this video was from about 20 years ago when one of the engineers on Project Crescent was interviewed. That's Amir Netz, talking about this fresh new thing in data visualization and innovation, in 2010, what appeared to be what I'm guessing, maybe was at a conference that might have been the predecessor to Ignite, because of course back in 2010 there was no Ignite, but it had the airs of Ignite. So it might be something, fun to watch if you like history and if you like trivia. So another thing that Power BI is not foreign to is the crowdsourcing that transcends across really many of the Microsoft products. Because when it comes to crowdsourcing, hey, that's how products, improve and get better and better because they listen to suggestions for development. And usually that's done through the platform of user voice. And this screenshot here, and it's also linkable to the Power BI user voice, where it highlights the top ideas that have been suggested and ranked that are, well, you can see that they're at least tagged for under review. Now, it doesn't mean that they're in development, but it could be that perhaps after the review, they'd be advanced to development. But again, this is something that I can't say often enough, that to leverage user voice for when you're working on Power BI and you're thinking, it's like, oh, I wish there was this. I wish this feature could do this, or whatever it might be. Check on user voice, search for it, because it could be someone else may have actually submitted that feature and vote on it. Or if no one else has voted on, and no one else has actually submitted it, then create it. But the key thing is that you do want to search to see if there is the feature already submitted, because that is how features are elevated and promoted and identified for potential development, because it does help Microsoft prioritize. So I can't say enough about user voice. And as you're working with Power BI, you may be tasked to become a Power BI administrator. Now, obviously, O365 M365 administrators are Power BI administrators. However, you don't have to be an O365 M365 administrator to be a Power BI administrator. So those administrators can assign select Power BI Pro users as administrators. So it shares the joy. So then they know that, all right, you're a key Power BI user. So I'm going to reward your efforts with being an administrator. So you're able to really empower or embrace how Power BI is delivered within your organization. Now, I've listed a couple of features of what you can do as a Power BI administrator. There's a lot more, and that you can find in the Microsoft documentation that's specified there. So that's something that you may need to look into, is that if you're not already a Power BI administrator, as perhaps maybe the key Power BI user and developer in your organization, that's something to look into, or to at least have the discussion with your M365, O365 administrators. So now, let's get into really taking that data and translating it into the knowledge and the storyline. And like almost everything else, it is an iterative process, really. it's like, well, life in itself is an iterative process. It's like do, learn, do, repeat, do again, and that's how we improve. So, this shouldn't be foreign. And it all starts with really the idea for the story. Once you have that idea, then it's to identifying those data sources, whether those data sources are in the public domain or might be within your organization. Again, it depends on what story you want to tell. And then it's taking that data and first cleaning it up and normalizing it so you're able to build really impactful and clean visuals using Power BI. Now, once in Power BI, don't forget to leverage all those various design and additional features to tell that story. Once you do that, you save, and then you publish. When you publish, you're publishing it to the web service, Power BI. That web application. Again, going back and emphasizing that Power BI Desktop and Power BI Service are complementary tools. They're not exclusive, they work together. And that also emphasizes that even those organizations that may have Power BI Premium does not exclude them that would require Power BI Pro licenses for the ones that are developing the stories. Once you publish to the Power BI service, the web application, then you can massage the report in order for your audience to consume it, or proceed and create the dashboard. Again, that goes back to really the first step in terms of the idea of how that data is consumed. Because remember, the dashboard is totally optional. You could still leave it at the report level for your audience to consume. And then, of course, is sharing the results, whether it's a report or a dashboard. And that includes either sharing it through email, and they'll just click on it, and then you could share it that way. They could collaborate, or embedding it in various other platforms. And I've included examples here. Of course, there's the SharePoint site, Microsoft Teams, or accessible through the phone. So now, let's tell the story. So here, this is the end result of a report that made it into a dashboard that I built, but that the story goes is really connecting two different data sources about health metrics. One, talking about various health attributes of select major cities coming from one data source, and somehow connecting it to another data source that tracks the COVID-19 infections and even deaths. But for this representation, it's only tracking the infections and the tests. And to see if perhaps there's maybe any correlation. There wouldn't be causation. Again, that's a whole different story, correlation versus causation. But this would be a correlation between perhaps various health metrics in certain major cities and maybe infection rates in those cities as well. Is there some sort of light? So now let's build something together. I genuflect, demo gods. Okay. So the first thing we want to see, oh, you tease there, are the data sources. Now again, we're going to be combining two different data sources to build these reports. One is a data set from the data platform of BCHC, that's the Big Cities Health Coalition. And most data sets out there are downloadable as really in tabular format. As you can see that it's the CSV file. And I'm taking the COVID data from the Institute of Health Metrics, which is actually based out of Washington. Just the way that the Johns Hopkins portal and team have also been tracking cases as well. IHME has been doing the same, not only in the United States, but also globally as well. And they've been tracking both the estimated and confirmed infections and the testing by location. And the data is downloadable. So we're taking both of those data, putting it into the report and the dashboard, and seeing if there's any sort of correlation between health attributes in a particular city and the infections. You never know. So we have that. I've already downloaded the data set. A couple of notes when you download such data sets that will be in a tabular format, like a delimiter file like CSV, is that you may want to convert that to an Excel format before you import it into Power BI, because it will make it a lot more readable, and you'll be able to manage and manipulate the data better. So that's one thing you do want to do. Another thing that you may want to do, but it's not necessary because you will be able to transform that data later on in Power BI, is that after you convert the delimiter file to an Excel file, you may want to actually convert the data set into an actual table, because that way Power BI will automatically identify the headers. Now, if you don't do that, that's okay, because there's a trick that you can do in Power BI in its query editor to do that. But again, totally optional. The key thing is that you do want to convert that into Excel. So we're in Power BI. Before we start importing the data, the one thing I just want to make mention is just review your settings, and the dialog box is going to just come up. Okay, I see there's a little lag. Okay, wow, there's a lot lag. Okay. Okay, one thing, in a couple of the settings, now I already have it selected here, but technically the GIS maps, okay, wow, there is a lag, are not selected by default. So that might be something that, especially if you do have location data, that you may want to enable that before you start building your report and then eventually publish it to the Power BI service. Now, of course, any changes that you make here would require a restart of the application. Since I already have it enabled, I don't need to, I'm not going to check it. But again, it's one of those small things just to remember to just review the settings, both application-wise and specific to the file. That might be relevant. Okay, I'm just going to get out of there. So to bring the data in, of course, when you select Get Data, it's going to pull up the most common sources that most everyone are going to import. But if you click on More, you'll be able to pull up the dialog box that will show all of the data sources that you could input. So once you do that, then you could see, and as you can see, it's, well, the list is endless. So, but I'll pause here. Okay. There we go. Okay. Excellent. I'm going to select Excel. going to go ahead and click connect. Of course, the dialog box comes up. We're going to first do the Boston Cities data set. That's basically just the general health metrics of really select cities. They didn't collect it from every single city, but the relatively major cities. A couple of things to point out. Of course, the worksheet comes in, you check it off. If you notice, you could tell that in the worksheet, the worksheet name has a very nondescript name. That's something to be aware of, and I'll show you where you could change that, because you would want to change that, especially if you're going to be working with multiple sources of data, and you want to be able to easily work with the data and knowing which fields come from which source, which data set. You just go through here. Of course, you have two options. Even though load is the one that obviously is highlighted, you want to go ahead and click on transform data first, because that's going to pull up the query editor. And that's going to allow you to dive right in and start to clean up and normalize the data initially. You could keep on going back and forth to the query editor as you work on your visuals, and you are going to anyhow, but it's good to start off with the query editor to really, as you bring in that data set. Okay, so, and remember I mentioned that there's going to be a couple of places that you could rename your data set. This is one of them. If you just right click, just click here, and we know this is the Health Coalition. Hit enter, voila. It's now more of a meaningful name. The other thing that you may want to do, as you just review, is that if you know
there you go.
any of your data components are a date item, such as year, being that year, yes, it's a number, but which of course Power BI would automatically identify it as a number. You don't want to leave it as a number because, well, you're not really going to be adding up a year. So you want to just change that. Change the data type to text. So it just cleans it up a bit. And the one thing that I want to point out too is that you will have the equivalent of like versioning, but of all the steps that you've applied in the query editor at your disposal. So if you notice here under applied steps, the latest step was change type. That's because we changed the data type from number to text. This is handy because what if you realize that it's like, oh, you didn't really wanted to do that, or what if you were just testing something out and it's like, oh, that's not going to look good. You could immediately just cancel out that step, and voila, it's back to number. Now, of course, I intended it to be text, so I'm putting it back. The other thing I just want to point out, I want to close, is the field for location, which of course in the Big City Health Coalition data set, it's labeled as place, which is fine. We could keep it at place. It's, arbitrary. Really, all the labels are arbitrary. It all depends on how you want to convey in the story. Plus, you'll be able to even rename it later as you build your visual. The thing that I want to point out is that keep in mind how the Big City Health Coalition formats its place is that it's only going to be select cities within the United States. So it's formatted as city and the 2-letter postal code for the state. That's something just to be aware of, because when we bring in the data set from the Institute of Health Metrics, you'll see that obviously the location data in that data set will be the state, because of course it's international data, so it will be both states and country. So that's something to be aware of, that you will need to address that, especially when you connect the pieces. So for now, we're just going to leave it like that. And as what you do with connecting the pieces, there's going to be a number of ways, but I won't get into it too much, because that could be part 2 as talking into more advanced features. So there's a little as well, it's applying the changes. Okay, so it's brought in. Now, of course, we're looking at a blank slate, literally, for Power BI Desktop, but we know that the data set was brought in because we see the field values in here. So a couple of things that you may want to consider before you start building the visuals is perhaps check out the app source if you would like to add any other visuals that you may want to use. Now, one of my favorites that you may like is the infographic designer, which would be applicable with the storyline that we're going to be building. When you're first still using this, now of course there's going to be visuals under my organization, and that's something that really a Power BI administrator can control, that if there's certain visuals that perhaps the organization wants to promote, will be listed there. But with the ones that are generally available, you may want to just, at least when you're first starting out, limit it to either the Power BI certified or the editor's picks. Now, that's not to say the other ones are not going to work, but it's just that they haven't been vetted yet. So we're just going to go ahead and add in the infographic designer. Okay, we're going to click on that. And we're going to start off, being that we're going to be talking about a whole, various specific cities. We'll start off with there, and we're going to add in, first we're going to specify the indicator as the category. And we want the columns to be the location. And then, of course, the measure, we'll leave it at the confidence interval. And of course, by default, it's going to switch there. Leave it at the count distinct. And there's a whole number of indicators. So, you know, it's a number of cities and so forth. So it's going to be a large graphic. But again, this is going to be something quick. We're not going to complete the story, but this is just to give you a sense of how to build it. So we have one particular visual here. A couple of things that you could do on the visual. Stop. Is you could format the visual. And when you're formatting the visual, there's something that perhaps you're not really content by the automatically generated title for the visual. Or perhaps you don't want the title. You could take it off. Or let's say you do want the title, but you could go ahead and see, we're going to see confidence level. Oh, I'm going to spell indicator by city. You know, we'll keep it simple. You could even change the font color. Let's do blue. Change the size. To that city. Even change the alignment. You know, again, all arbitrary. So that's just one general thing to do. So we have that visible in there. And we're going to, so it's nice to actually have a nice table that presents the data in a tabular format. So here, we're going to emphasize the place. In this case, we'll add in the category and the indicator, and let's put in the year. And yeah, the confidence interval. Oh, you want to drag over. And we just build it in there, and we have it in there. So again, the same thing. You could format that table quickly. Why not? Let's do contrast alternating. See, quickly. You don't have to apply any CSS to it. You know, and you could even change the colors from that. Additional field formatting or even conditional formatting. And even with the conditional formatting, you could add in that if certain figures have a particular value, it'll flag it with an icon. So there's definitely select features that you can do. And then we're just going to add in, let's say, a slicer. And let's add in a year for this one. And of course, with any of the slicers, you can leave it at that or do this drop down. Do a drop down, it provides more real estate. So we'll leave it at that. Why not? We can add in, let's add in one more slicer. And this time, we'll add in the cities. Oh. Just change the design. And then once you do that, after you build your visual, this of course is not the final, step, but again, you're building it component wise. And then once you do that, then you could design the page itself by either using a background or wallpaper. So in this case, we'll do the background. You can either add an image or you could just leave it as a color. So in this particular case, let's do an orange, and we're going to adjust the transparency. And there you go. So, and one last step is we're going to rename that so we know this is the data set from the Big City Health Coalition. So we have the one data set already in here. So let's build up another page. And we're going to now bring in the data set from the Institute of Health Metrics. So we bring it in. And again, the same thing happens here. We transform the data. A couple of things that you just want to do. So of course, again, the year here, I want to change that to text. And last time we changed the dataset name in the query editor. I'm not going to change it here because there's another place that you could change it, just so you know that there's, more than one way to skin a cat. So, oh, wait a second, this is the wrong, what the hell? Oops. I think I grabbed the wrong data. We're going to discard those changes, because that was the same one as the data set. Go back in here. Here we go. Okay, that was just a slight detour.
Okay.
All right. Pulling it into the query editor. Okay. So of course here, we're just going to, a couple of things you could always do in a query editor. Change the field labels, change that to here. Date is date, because in this case it's formatted there. We're going to leave it like that. That's fine. And we're just going to scroll the list for the other data that we want. Now, at any point in time, if you're not really going to be working with any of the columns, you could always remove the columns under manage columns, whether it's one or more. But, for the sake of time, I'm just going to leave all in there. And we're right here. So in this particular case, just so it's there, we're going to rename total tests. Confirmed infections. And we're going to grab in the average for the estimated infections. Just leave it like that. Okay, and for now, we're not going to apply any calculations and measures. We're just going to leave it like that. I'm going to go ahead and apply the changes, and it's going to load that data into the application. There's a little bit of a lag. Okay. And so as you can see here, we see that the data was brought in, which of course it came in under the name that was in the data set. We can go ahead and rename it here to, let's say, IHME. So now we immediately know which data set is which, because of course, with something with a nondescript name, you're not going to really know or remember. It's like, oh, which is which, until you dive in. So it's, again, it's all about the labels and the naming convention. So in this particular case, for tracking name conventions, let's use the area graph. So we have the area graph, and we want to we want to have the access to be the really the date. But instead of showing it with all the attributes of date, let's say we really don't want it to track it daily. We just want the month. So you're just going to exclude everything else and just keep the month. And then we're going to bring in the confirmed and estimated infections in the total test. But there's one thing that you may need to do. If you notice, when it brought it in, by default, it summarized the data points. You don't want it summarized. So you want to make sure that's highlighted. Now, you could have done this in the query editor, but I purposely showed it here because, again, just the way that you could rename the data set, you could do the same thing here. So we got to bring that in, confirm, and do the same thing with the estimated. Change it out. All right. And last but not least, same thing with the total test. I'm going to bring that in there. And of course, you may not want it as count, so you may want to just take out the count of. I'm going to do that. And finally, do this one. Oh, and we have that. And of course, with something like this, we're going to go into the formatting. Of course, we have the legend. We're going to take out the legend, but we're going to turn on the data labels, because as you hover over, it's going to show up there. Now, of course, it's all the points, and it has the title, but let's say for the sake of argument, we're just going to take that off. And for the y-axis, we're going to turn off the title. So we have this, and we have that now, and you could build up additional visuals in here. And in this particular case, we could build in a wallpaper. And let's do the yellow in there. And do a little bit more transparent. And then we have that. Rename. Now it's going to be nice to rename your pages, because it's handy, especially if you're going to be sharing the report. Those pages will be treated as a table of contents. So after you build that, then there's one last thing that you may want to do, is that you want to connect the data. So you're in the modeling view, and you want to connect the data between the two data sets. Now, you can actually have Power BI automatically detecting relationships. Of course, it's not going to find any, because it's not obvious to Power BI. Because of course, in one data set, you have the one location named as place, and then the other one is location. Now, of course, it is many to many, and there's specific cautionary tales, so you have to be watchful to look into. But I won't go into it. That's a little bit more advanced. Maybe that's part 2 or part 3 of my session. So you want to just be watchful of that. But the other thing that you will have to do later on is really normalize the data between the locations, because remember I mentioned that one data set has the postal code for the state and it's spelled out in the other data set. So that's just something to keep in mind. And I'm going to let it apply. Now, of course, if you go here, I'll just go down so you could see where it makes the connection. If you go here, there we go. And there, and once that's all done, you of course save, and then when you publish, and then once you publish, of course, any of the pages, reports, go right into the web application, which is, I won't do it because I already have it in there. And voila, that's right there. Of course, it gets published as a report. So and see what I'm saying, that if you label your pages with a more meaningful name, you're able to control that as a piece of navigation for your audience that's going to consume the data. And then you could if you do build a dashboard, you can either put the whole page into the dashboard simply by just clicking on the ellipsis and pin the live page, or the components. And once you do that, it creates the dashboard, and you have that dashboard. And of course, the dashboard can be exported or shared via email to the audience that's going to consume it. Or if you are going to be embedding the storyline, you can do that at the report level. Again, clicking on the ellipsis and just selecting on the embed menu. One thing I do want to point out is that there is an option to publish to the web. That is always an option, but you want to be watchful before you publish anything to the web, especially if it's data that's proprietary or anything that you really don't want to expose to the public, because once you do, it will be. So that's just a small little caveat. So we're going to go back into the presentation to wrap up, and I reiterate a few points that you may just want to consider. They're perhaps minor points, but it may make your life easier as you really develop and transform that raw data into that story that you want to convey to your audience. And there's a number of documentation that I mentioned throughout the session, including the blog articles that talked about Project Crescent for those history buffs out there. And as you get into Power BI, you may want to reference a couple of style guides and, of course, DAX. And if you do get into DAX, I do recommend following Ginger Grant's blog, as she discusses DAX quite a bit. And speaking of followings, there are a couple of Power BI gurus that I mentioned. There's a lot more, but the ones that are synonymous with Power BI, of course, are Guys in the Cube. That's Adam Saxton and Patrick LeBlanc. And the Bifocal Show, Jason Himmelstein and John White. You could follow them via their show handles or individually. Of course, I put the show handles there because it's the equivalent to their podcast and YouTube channels that if you don't already follow them, I do encourage, but you could always link for that information from their Twitter handles. And last but not least, if you're not already involved, there's a number of Power Platform and dynamic communities that are specific to Power BI that I mentioned there. So I want to thank everyone, and before we open it up to questions, I leave you with one of my favorite quotes that perhaps any fellow thespians may know James Thurber. It's better to know some of the questions than all of the answers. And last but not least, don't forget to visit the vendor booth where you're able to answer that raffle quiz that the link is in the lower right, which will enable you to possibly win an Oculus Quest. And hopefully you remember to provide feedback both at the event level and the speaker level, because I'm just like the organizers really want to hear from you to learn how to make the conference better. I want to hear from you to see how I can make any of my sessions better for you, the audience. And